Um, Imagine standing in the ashes of your home, just watching the army that burned it march away with everything you own.
Right. It's a pretty dark place to start.
It really is. The geopolitical reality of your world is, well, entirely dictated by their violence. And now, imagine someone hands you a poem,
Okay.
but it doesn't tell you to find inner peace. It doesn't ask you to forgive them. It tells you in visceral, terrifying detail exactly how the universe is going to tear that specific empire apart.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a completely different kind of message.
Exactly. And that's what we're looking at today. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today we're sharing straight into the book of Nahum.
Which is such an intense text to dig into.
Oh, for sure. It's a brief, highly concentrated ancient text, and we're looking at a bilingual Hebrew-English source for this.
Hmm.
Our mission today is to bypass the sanitized version of history and look directly at its profound and, frankly, shocking message of divine judgment.
Yeah, we are unpacking the dramatic downfall of the ancient city of Nineveh.
Right.
And, doing that requires reading this not as a dry historical ledger, but as a deeply emotional, highly structured vision.
A vision. How so?
Well, Nahum is actively trying to make you feel the crushing weight of an empire's collapse. It's I guess you could call it a psychological and theological dissection of what happens when a superpower builds its entire existence on systemic extortion.
Systemic extortion. Okay, so reading through this source material, I have to argue that it feels, well, overwhelmingly violent.
It definitely doesn't pull any punches.
Not at all. In fact, verse 2 uses this striking Hebrew phrase right out of the gate, Elkanah v'nokim.
Meaning a jealous and avenging God.
Right. A jealous and avenging God. It explicitly states he, quote, reserveth wrath for his enemies.
Right.
And looking at the broader landscape of ancient prophetic texts, this feels, I don't know, entirely unhinged from our usual concepts of spiritual justice.
You think it feels unhinged?
Well, yeah. I mean, you read other prophets like Amos or Micah, and their vision of justice is deeply internal. It's about, taking care of the poor, reforming corrupt courts.
Establishing social equity, basically.
Exactly. Then you hit Nahum, and the deity is like throwing a cosmic temper tantrum, shattering mountains and drying up oceans just to annihilate a foreign city. It reads less like justice and more like a terrifying revenge fantasy.
I get why you'd say that, but the contrast with prophets like Amos is actually exactly where the brilliance of this text lies.
Wait, really? Brilliant how?
Well, Amos is addressing internal societal decay, right? So his concept of justice naturally has to be reformative.
Right, because he's talking to his own people.
Exactly. But Nahum is addressing an external existential threat. Nineveh wasn't just a misbehaving neighbor, it was the capital of the Assyrian Empire.
Which was basically a massive war machine.
Yes, a war machine notorious for pioneering state-sponsored terror. The victims of Nineveh aren't looking for Assyria to have a change of heart.
Because they're literally being crushed by them.
Exactly. And honestly, another prophet, Jonah, already explored that very premise with this exact city, right?
Oh, right. The whole repentance angle.
Exactly. But Nahum's audience, they don't need Nineveh to repent. They need the war machine dismantled.
I see.
So when the text describes God's fury being poured out like fire in verse 6, breaking rocks asunder, you really have to ask yourself, who is standing behind the person throwing that fire?
Oh, I see what you mean. The oppressed, the nations that Assyria crushed.
Precisely, the people who desperately need a stronghold. And the text establishes that duality immediately. It's the whole introduction to the narrative structure.
Right. Chapter 1 acts as the introduction.
Yeah. In the very next breath after describing quaking mountains, Nahum chapter 1 verse 7 says, "The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that take refuge in him."
Wow. Okay, so it flips right from pure wrath to absolute comfort.
Exactly. To the victims of systemic oppression, this terrifying, earth-shattering power isn't a temper tantrum at all. It is their only defense.
So the wrath is the mechanism for the mercy.
Yes. God's intense anger is the necessary mechanism for delivering justice to those who have been crushed by a system they cannot fight themselves. The wrath and the mercy are just two sides of the exact same action.
Which is a terrifying dual nature to grapple with.
It really is.
Because you're essentially talking about a controlled burn.
Yeah.
Like, if you are standing right in the path of a massive wildfire, it's a monster.
Oh, absolutely. A force of pure annihilation.
Right. But if you're the forest itself, like a forest that has been choked out by invasive parasitic weeds and desperately needs the dead brush cleared away so that new life can actually grow.
Then that exact same fire is salvation.
Exactly. The fire's morality depends entirely on your relationship to the ecosystem.
That tension is the core of Nahum's introduction. The text forces you to confront the uncomfortable reality that stopping immense systemic violence often requires immense systemic destruction.
Okay, I see the mechanics of that argument, but does the text actually care about the salvation of the forest? Or is it just, I don't know, relishing the destruction of the brush?
What makes you say that?
Well, I look at verse 10, which says the enemies will be, quote, devoured as stubble fully dry. It sounds like the author is genuinely enjoying the prospect of the burn.
I mean, it is a very visceral, vindicated tone.
Right. But pure cosmic rage isn't enough to build a cohesive case for ultimate justice. You need a mechanism of execution. An empire doesn't just evaporate because a poet is angry.
No, it doesn't.
So how does a seemingly invincible superpower actually collapse in real time? To answer that, the text shifts its narrative structure away from the heavens and brings us down into the dirt.
Right. We move into the active development of this vision in chapter 2.
And the tone changes completely.
It does. The abstract courtroom of cosmic justice is replaced by the visceral reality of a battlefield.
And the sensory details of this siege are explosive, like you can almost see a camera violently panning across the chaos of the streets.
It's very cinematic.
Super cinematic. The text describes the shields of the mighty man made red, the valiant men dressed in scarlet, and then it zooms in on the steel chariots.
Right, rushing madly through the streets.
Yeah, jostling against each other in the broad places. It says the appearance of them is like torches. They run to and fro like the lightnings.
It's so chaotic. You aren't just told the city falls, you are forced into the panic of its final moments.
Right, the speed of it is terrifying.
And the speed of the collapse is exactly what the text wants you to focus on. An empire that took centuries of blood to build is unraveling in minutes.
The defenses fail instantly. The palace itself physically dissolves in the narrative.
Yes. And the bilingual source text has this incredible moment that highlights the totality of that unraveling.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. In describing the aftermath of this lightning-fast siege, there is a fascinating Hebrew wordplay.
It's brilliant.
Yeah, so the English translation simply says the city is empty and void and waste. But the Hebrew words right there in the source text are buka, umebuka, umebulaka.
It is an absolute masterclass in phonetic poetry.
It really is. The very sound of the original language mimics the draining of a massive jar.
Like water violently pouring out.
Exactly. Glug, 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 buka, umebulaka. It perfectly mirrors the psychological and physical emptying of Nineveh.
Which is so poetic because just a verse prior, the text says, "Take ye the spoil of silver, take the spoil of gold, for there is no end of the store."
Right. This city was a bottomless hoard of stolen global wealth.
And suddenly, it's just tipped over and drained completely dry.
Drained dry. Wow.
And once the city is completely drained, the text introduces one of the most profound metaphors in ancient literature.
The lion metaphor.
Exactly. It asks a taunting rhetorical question to the ruins. Where is the den of the lions, which was the feeding place of the young lions?
Yeah, and it goes on to describe how this lion tore prey to pieces, strangled it for his lionesses, and filled his caves with the bodies.
Which is a horrifying image of extortion and violence.
It is, but honestly, I have to challenge the use of that metaphor.
Really? Why?
Well, comparing an extractive, brutal empire to a lion, it kind of makes them sound majestic.
Huh. Majestic.
Yeah. It almost makes their dominance sound like the natural order of the world. Like, of course the lion hunts. It's the king of the jungle.
I see where you're going with this.
Right. The text says they walked there and, quote, none made them afraid. Doesn't this kind of glorify the very violence it's supposed to be condemning?
That's a great point. And you know what? Assyria's own kings would have aggressively agreed with your assessment.
Wait, really?
Oh, absolutely. Ancient empires, and Assyria in particular, love to portray themselves as mighty lions in their art, their architecture, and their state propaganda.
Oh, like a PR campaign.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They carved massive reliefs of their kings hunting lions, symbolically dominating the apex predator.
Wow. Okay.
So Nahum isn't endorsing their majesty. He is weaponizing their own arrogant PR against them.
Oh, taking the mythology they use to terrorize others and turning it into their own indictment.
Precisely. The lion genuinely thought it was untouchable. They thought tearing other nations to pieces to fill their own caves was just the natural cosmic order.
That might make their...
Right. But then God speaks directly to the apex predator. "Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts."
Oh, wow. The ultimate predator is finally meeting a force it cannot outhunt or outmuscle.
Exactly. God burning their chariots in the smoke and cutting off the young lions is a theological statement. It's saying that predatory empires cannot sustain themselves indefinitely,
Because eventually you run out of prey.
or you anger the wrong entity. When a system exists purely to strangle others and hoard the spoils, it makes an enemy of the fabric of reality itself.
So the ultimate predator realizes too late that it is actually the prey.
Exactly.
Okay, I concede the genius of turning their own lion imagery against them. That is brilliant.
It really is.
But to fully understand why this absolute uncompromising judgment was inevitable, we have to look at the concluding arguments of Nahum's narrative, right?
Yes, chapter 3, the conclusion of the structure.
Right, and this section functions almost like a formal rap sheet. It lays out the exact structural crimes of what it bluntly titles the Bloody City.
This is where the narrative demands we look at the specific mechanisms of Assyria's power. It justifies that terrifying storm we witness at the beginning.
Yeah, the indictment starts strong. Woe to the bloody city! It is all full of lies and rapine. The prey departeth not.
It describes a civilization built entirely on deception and violent extraction.
But it goes further than just physical violence, doesn't it? It calls Nineveh a well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcrafts, that selleth nations through her harlotries and families through her witchcrafts.
Right. And to be clear, the text is describing a deeply corrupt geopolitical system here.
So it's not literal witchcraft.
No, the terms witchcrafts and harlotries here are metaphors for diplomatic manipulation and economic exploitation. Assyria was trading in human lives. They used deceit, broken treaties, and coercive alliances to enslave entire families and sovereign nations.
Okay, but even understanding that history, the brutality described in this final section is just relentlessly extreme.
It is very dark.
It talks about the horseman charging, the flashing sword, and then just this endless pile of bodies. The text literally says, there is no end of the corpses, and they stumble upon their corpses.
Yeah, the imagery is heavy.
And then the divine voice says, he will uncover her skirts, show the nations her nakedness, cast detestable things, literally dung upon her, and make her vile.
It's a complete dismantling of their dignity.
Right, and as a modern reader, I have to ask, doesn't this level of public humiliation, sexualized shaming, and endless gore seem entirely excessive for a supposedly just deity?
It's a fair question.
I mean, it feels like the text is crossing a line from justice into sheer sadism.
I hear that. The imagery is intentionally repulsive, but that's because the reality of Assyrian conquest was repulsive.
Okay.
But the text actually defends its own concept of justice by pointing to a specific, deeply traumatic historical event.
Which event?
Nahum asks Nineveh a sarcastic question in verse 8. Art thou better than Noaman?
Wait, Noaman? Like Thebes?
Exactly. Thebes, the cultural jewel of Egypt.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, the text reminds the reader that it was situated among rivers, right? With the sea as a rampart.
Yes. And it had infinite strength from alliances with Ethiopia, Egypt, Put, and Lubim. It was supposed to be completely impregnable.
It was the superpower of its day.
It was. And what did Nineveh do to Noaman when they conquered it? The text doesn't shy away from the horrific details.
What does it say?
It reminds Nineveh that Noaman was carried away into captivity. Quote, her young children also were dashed in pieces at the head of all the streets, and they cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains.
Oh, wow. So the text is forcing Nineveh to look in the mirror.
Exactly. They committed these exact atrocities.
They threw the first stone, so to speak.
Right. Nahum is highlighting a flawless cycle of retributive justice. The psychological terror here is that the punishment mirrors the crime with horrifying exactness.
So the public shaming, the endless corpses, the total humiliation.
It isn't God inventing new, unusually cruel ways to punish a city. This is the universe ensuring that Nineveh reaps the exact horrific harvest that it spent centuries sowing across the globe.
The geopolitical shockwaves they sent out by destroying Noaman are just now returning to their own gates.
Precisely. Nineveh is simply experiencing the brutal reality it legislated for everyone else.
Okay, that shifts the perspective completely. The scales of justice actually are balancing.
They are.
But because the crimes stacked on one side of the scale are so unimaginably monstrous, the balancing of the scale looks like a catastrophe. It looks like a hurricane.
That is the ultimate paradox of divine justice in Nahum. True justice for the oppressor always looks like an apocalypse.
That is a chilling thought. And the text gives us one final brilliant analogy to explain the underlying fragility of this mighty empire, doesn't it?
Yes, the metaphors at the end are fantastic.
It compares Nineveh's massive, imposing fortresses to Fig trees with the first ripe figs. If they be shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater.
They're just ripe for the taking.
Right. And then it turns its attention to their merchants and their political leaders, comparing them to a swarm of locusts.
Which completely dismantles the illusion of Nineveh's internal strength.
It really does. The text says these marshals and leaders are like grasshoppers that camp in the walls when it's a cold day. But the moment the sun rises, they flee away, and no one even knows where they went.
It's the ultimate description of mercenary loyalty.
It's like a massive corporate shell company.
That's a great way to put it.
The leaders and merchants are perfectly happy to huddle up and feed off the city when things are comfortable and the money is flowing.
Of course they are.
But the second the auditors show up, the second the heat of the sun actually hits them, the board of directors dissolves the entity and scatters.
Because there's no loyalty to the city. The city wasn't a community. It was just a feeding ground.
Exactly.
Extractive systems have no foundation of truth, community, or mutual care holding them together. When an empire is held together only by fear and greed, it is fundamentally fragile.
It looks invincible from the outside, like a massive stone wall.
But inside, there is no structural integrity.
Uka umebruka umebulaka.
Yeah.
Empty, void, and waste.
Right back to that wordplay.
Yeah. The shell collapses the moment pressure is applied.
And that brings us to the very end of the text. And you know, Nahum doesn't offer a traditional resolution.
He doesn't.
No. Instead, he addresses the king of Assyria directly with a haunting final line.
I find it. Here. All that hear the report of thee, clap the hands over thee, for upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually?
The entire ancient world is giving a standing ovation to their destruction.
Because every single nation had suffered under their cruelty.
It's a sobering image. But it also challenges you, the reader, to look at the mechanisms of power in our own era.
How so?
Think about the systems, the massive corporations, or the political structures today that seem absolutely invincible. If their wickedness passes continually over people, if they operate purely as apex predators extracting wealth and leaving devastation, the blueprint of Nahum suggests their permanence is a complete illusion.
They're just ripe figs waiting for the tree to be shaken.
Exactly.
Wow. That leaves you with one final, incredibly uncomfortable thread to pull.
Which is?
While Nahum's terrifying prophecy was completely fulfilled, Nineveh did fall, completely and utterly, to the Babylonians.
They did.
But the Babylonians didn't dismantle the war machine. They just took the keys.
Yeah, they really did.
They became the exact same kind of apex predator, and the violent cycle of empire continued. It forces you to wonder, does destroying the bloody city actually cure the disease of empire?
Or does it just hand the lion's den over to a new, hungrier set of lions?
Right. It's just as simply clearing the board for the next predator.
And the text doesn't answer that. It simply promises that the storm always, inevitably catches up to the bloody city.
Whoever happens to be living in it at the time.
Exactly.
The scales don't always balance with the clean, civilized tap of a gavel. Sometimes the only way to clear the dead brush is to let the wildfire burn.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Book of Nahum. If you want to keep exploring the psychological, historical, and philosophical depths of the world's most intense source materials with us, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss an extraction of insight. We'll see you next time.